demons, ghosts, and other entities which stalk the night or day. These few stories you are going to hear are encounters of demons and other spirits lurking where you least expect. These are true ghost stories. If you enjoy these stories, or you would just like to spread the word and support me, go ahead and like, share, subscribe, and delve into the nature that is ghosts and spirits. Demon of Detroit. The Demon of Detroit is a true scary story about the Cole Adams house in Detroit, Michigan, which was said to be haunted by a horrible thing of unspeakable terror. It all started in the early 1960s when Mr. and Mrs. Adams moved into the house in Detroit, Michigan. They had 5 small children and a pet dog. Almost as soon as they moved in, the family seemed to sense that there was something wrong with the back bedroom. All of the children avoided it, and even the dog refused to go inside. It was a tiny room with just enough space for a bed and a built-in closet in the corner. Mr. Adams worked the night shift at the Cadillac assembly plant, so when he came home in the morning, he would sleep in the back bedroom. It was far enough away from the rest of the house that he thought no one would disturb him. However, sleeping in the bedroom always gave him a strange and uneasy feeling. Almost immediately, he began to experience horrible nightmares. They were so vivid and real that he would wake up screaming and shaking with fear. In one of the ghastly nightmares, he dreamed that he opened the closet door and the blood-soaked and mutilated body of a woman fell out. As the days went by, the dreams became worse and worse. He lost so much sleep and he was so exhausted that he ended up moving back to the master bedroom with his wife. The nightmares suddenly stopped. When his mother came to visit the family, they let her sleep in the back bedroom. The next morning, she said she didn't get a wink of sleep. Her face was pale and her whole body was shaking. She claimed she had heard terrible sounds in the room that went on all night long, as if someone was trying to break in. She refused to sleep in the bedroom again and decided to cut her way short and go home. After that, Mr. and Mrs. Adams began to realize that something dark and loathsome was lurking in the back bedroom. Then, an old friend of the family came down to town and they gave him the room for the night. They didn't mention anything about the unpleasant experiences in the room, but they had an inclination upon arrival. Shortly after midnight, the man was lying in bed when he was awakened by the feeling of someone turning him over. He opened his eyes and saw someone standing outside the bedroom door. It was a woman with long hair, but she had her back to him. She was wearing a short fur coat and a blue dress. He got up and started walking towards but all of a sudden, every light in the house went off. He was stumbling around in the darkness, and when the lights came back on again, he found himself in the kitchen. Miss Adams was there, washing her hair in the kitchen sink. All of a sudden, they heard a terrible, unearthly wailing sound that left both of them speechless with fright, and a sickening smell filled the room. Then the heavy trapdoor in the kitchen floor that led to the dirt basement started opening and slamming back down. Terrified, they called the police. Within minutes, a few officers were searching the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find anything. The next morning, when Mr. Adams got home from the plant, his wife and friend were waiting for him. As calmly as they could, they told him what they had experienced during the night. He didn't believe them. That evening, he decided to sleep in the back bedroom. He was just about to drift off when he heard someone moving in the room. He thought it was his wife, but when he called her name, there was no answer. He turned over to look and saw a hideous face just inches from him. It was the most horrible thing he had ever seen. The eyes stared past him and the mouth moved to talk, but all that came out was a hissing sound and a terrible stench. Mr. Adams came running out of the back bedroom, his eyes wide and screaming with terror. He was ripping handfuls of hair from his head as he ran. His friend tried to grab him and hold him down, but Mr. Adams went berserk, kicking and fighting. Finally, his wife and his friend managed to throw a bucket over him and wrestle him to the floor. The house was filled with the same nauseating stench they had smelled the night before. An hour later, he had calmed down enough to tell his family about the ghostly and indiscernible face he had seen. The husband and wife grabbed their sleeping children from their beds and fled into the night. The next morning, they all moved in with Miss Adams' parents in a different part of Detroit. The Adams family had to admit defeat, and they left the house and the back bedroom to the horrifying entity that was lurking in it, the Demon of Detroit. The Greenbrier Ghost. Greenbrier is a true story of a ghost of a young woman who was murdered in 1897 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. They say her ghost returned from the grave to name her killer. This story is also known as the Greenbrier Ghost. There was a young woman named Elva Zona Shue who lived in Greenbrier County in Western Virginia. She was married to a man named Edward who worked as a blacksmith. They seemed very happy together, but Zona's mother never liked Edward Shue and warned her daughter not to trust him. One day, they had been married only 3 months. Edward sent a young African-American boy named Andy Jones to his house on an errand. He was supposed to ask Zona if there was anything she needed from the store. The boy found Zona's body lying on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Her eyes were wide open and staring right at him. She was dead. The boy ran home to tell his mother, and she raised the alarm. Edward went home, carried his wife's body up to the bedroom, and dressed her in her Sunday best. When the coroner arrived an hour later, he found the dead woman wearing a stiff-collared dress that covered her neck, and she had a veil over her face. Edward was cradling his wife's head and sobbing hysterically. When the coroner tried to take a closer look, Edward reacted so violently that the coroner gave up and left. He listed her cause of death as being due to childbirth. The strangest thing about it was that Zona had not even been pregnant. When Zona's mother found out her daughter was dead, she shouted, "The devil has killed her." During the funeral, Zona's mother took a sheet from inside the coffin and brought it home. When she washed it in the basin, the water turned as red as blood. The old woman believed this was a sign that Zona had been murdered. Every night for the next 4 weeks, Zona's mother prayed that the truth about her daughter would be revealed. She didn't have long to wait. One night, the ghost of Zona appeared to her mother and told her exactly how she had died. She said Edward was cruel and abusive to her. One day, he went too far. She told him she had no meat for his dinner, and Edward flew into a rage. He attacked his wife and broke her neck. When she said this, the ghost slowly turned her head completely around at the neck. The next morning, Zona's mother went to the police and told them what she had seen. Although they were skeptical, they dug up Zona's body again and performed a proper autopsy. When he heard the news, Edward began to get nervous and stressed out. He wandered around the town saying, "They will not be able to prove I did it." The autopsy revealed that Zona's neck had been broken and she had been strangled to death. On her throat were the marks of fingers. Edward Shue was arrested and charged with murder. When the police investigated his background, they found some suspicious facts. Edward had a violent temper. He had beaten his wife severely and thrown her out of the house. And that was her first wife. His second wife had died mysteriously of a blow to the head. As he sat in his jail cell, Edward was sure he would not be convicted of Zona's murder. He told everyone he would listen that there was no evidence against him. During the trial, Zona's mother was called to testify on the stand. She told the jury how Zona's ghost had appeared to her and revealed the name of her murderer. Nobody knows if the jury took her story seriously, but they did come back with a guilty verdict, and Edward was sentenced to life in prison. He died a few years later in Mudsville Penitentiary. The Handshake. The Handshake is a true ghost story about a man who dumped his fiancée before the wedding. It is also known as the cold hand or the ice cold handshake. In an old forgotten cemetery just north of Goldsboro, North Carolina, there is a headstone that is cracked in half and held together by a pair of rusty brackets. Engraved at the top, there is the strangely haunting image of a handshake. The name on the grave is George Dean's, and this is his story. Back in 1856, there was a 17-year-old girl named Rachel Vinson who thought she had found the man of her dreams. He was 8 years older than her, and his name was George Deans. Rachel dreamed about the beautiful wedding they would have. She was head over heels in love, but unfortunately George didn't feel the same way about her. He had a wandering eye, and soon he was cheating on her with a number of other girls. When she found out that he was being unfaithful, Rachel was devastated. However, she didn't want to lose him, so she told him how much she loved him and said that she would still marry him if he stopped seeing other girls. George wasn't a very sensitive person, and he bluntly dumped her. Rachel's heart was broken, and she felt like she could never love again. She fell into a deep, dark spiral of sadness and depression. Within weeks, her uncontrollable grief made her sick. She came down with a fever, and her body grew weaker and weaker. She had lost the will to live. One day, she called George to her bedside and asked him to lean in close. Then she whispered in his ear, "I realize I can never have you in this world," she said, "but I shall claim you in the next." The next day, Rachel died. She was buried in the little graveyard, and George tried to put her out of his thoughts and go on about his life. Almost a year later, George Deans was wandering home from a Christmas party, tipsy with drink. His route took him past the graveyard where Rachel was buried. As he walked, he saw a strange fog-like mist ringing out of the cemetery. It came floating towards him over the headstones and gradually formed into the ghostly figure of a woman. She started shaking and staggered backward as he recognized Rachel's face. He was so frightened that he was unable to run as the ghostly apparition came closer and closer. Suddenly, it reached out and grabbed his hand. Its touch was icy cold, colder than death. Then, in an instant, the apparition vanished. George was found wandering aimlessly down the road. He seemed to be in a daze, and his right hand hung limp by his side. It was frozen solid. From then on, he suffered from excruciating pain in the hand the ghost had touched. Within days, his hand began to wither and shrivel up. Eventually, it dangled uselessly at his side. George Deans never married and spent the rest of his life alone. When he died, he was buried in the same cemetery as Rachel Vinson. In his will, he left instructions for that ghostly image to be chiseled on the tombstone above his name. 2 hands eternally clasped in an ice-cold handshake.